Bueno, gracias, doctor Garí. Sí, estoy muy contento de poder participar con todos vosotros desde Inglaterra. Y bueno, sin más dilaciones, me gustaría presentar al profesor Daniel Philpott. Él ha sido catedrático adjunto de estudios de paz del Croft Institute en Estados Unidos. En la actualidad es catedrático de ciencias políticas de la Universidad de Notre Dame en Indiana. Ha sido profesor visitante en las universidades de Harvard, Princeton y en Berlín, en Alemania. Y también como activista por la paz, ha sido mediador en Kashmir, en el conflicto entre India y Pakistán, China, así como en la región de los Grandes Lagos en África. So we are really delighted, Professor Philpott, you are here today with us. And yeah, I just let you now to share with us whatever you want to share today with us. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you very much. And it is a great honor to speak to this webinar of historical memory of the research group and Society of Historical Memory and Reconciliation. I'm very grateful to Professor Juan Manuel Jimenez Robles for his kind invitation, and to the International University of Catalonia in Barcelona. And I extend my best wishes in your creation of a research group on memory, peace, human rights, and reconciliation, and in your larger efforts to study and promote reconciliation from your position in Spain. I have long been interested in Spain's many years of efforts to address the past of its civil war and of the Franco dictatorship, even decades after its transition to democracy in the late 1970s. Several students of mine have written papers and theses on the subject. I also thank you for your patience as I speak in English, and I wish I knew Spanish better. Come with me from Spain to the country of Uganda, another country that has had to deal with its past in recent years. There, the past arises from a civil war of 25 years fought in the north of the country between the members of the Lord's Resistance Army and the government of Uganda. The Lord's Resistance Army is a bizarre cultish organization led by Joseph Kony. He and his group promise a Uganda ruled by the 10 Commandments. But he seems to have overlooked one: do not kill. His recruitment strategy has been the forceful abduction of teenage boys as well as girls to serve as their wives, really meaning sex slaves. His military strategy was to force the boy soldiers to raid villages, killing and maiming their inhabitants and burning their dwellings. At the peak of the movement, some 20 to 30,000 abductees were in his army. The war, which began in the late 1980s, killed tens of thousands of people and forced some 2 million into camps for internally displaced peoples. Proposals for peace came from different directions. One came from the International Criminal Court, or the ICC. The International Criminal Court was created by an international coalition of lawyers and human rights activists who wanted to revive the tradition of the Nuremberg trials, which famously tried Nazi war criminals after World War II. The court was established through an international treaty in 1998 and began operation in 2002. For its first indictments, the ICC turned to Uganda's Lord's Resistance Army, 5 of whose leaders they chose to indict, hoping that they could be arrested and brought to The Hague for trial. A separate approach to peace comes from a woman named Angelina Atyam from a town in Uganda called Lira. Her daughter, Charlotte, was abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army in 1996, along with some 130 other girls from her Catholic boarding school. Distressed, helpless, and angry, Atyam and other parents of the abducted girls met regularly at the local Catholic cathedral to pray for the release of the girls. Prayer did not come easily, though, and was hindered by their anger. Finally, one day when they came to the phrase, as we forgive those in the Lord's Prayer. Angelina and other parents came to the realization that God was calling them to forgive the abductors of their daughters. Angelina followed the call that she had heard. She even found the mother of the soldier who held her daughter in captivity, and through her forgave him, his family, and his clan. Later, when this soldier was killed in the conflict, she wept and offered her condolences. She came to speak regularly to other parents of abducted children and urged forgiveness. Angelina's activities were not confined to forgiveness. She and other parents formed the Concerned Parents Association, which advocated for the girls' release and began to bring international attention to their abduction. Then, Coney himself became worried about the international publicity and had one of his minions approach Angelina and offer to release her daughter if the parents would cease the international advocacy. Angelina refused, saying that she would only cease the publicity if the LRA released all of the girls. Eventually, Charlotte was released after spending 7.5 years in captivity. Angelina's approach to violence and injustice echoed that of a group of religious leaders who constitutes one of the world's greatest examples of religious leaders who have exercised leadership for peace and reconciliation. Known as the Acholi Religious Leaders Peace Initiative, or ARLPI, these leaders banded together in the mid-1990s to advocate for an end to war. Their leader was Catholic Archbishop John Baptist Odama, who teamed up with Anglican bishops as well as the leading Muslim sheikh in northern Uganda. The ARLPI was a leading force behind the Amnesty Act of 2000, passed by the Ugandan parliament, a cornerstone of the peace process that enabled thousands of child soldiers to leave the LRA and return home. The ARLPI is a strong opponent of the ICC indictments, which it says has only prevented the LRA leaders from making peace. Several of the ARLP leaders ventured through the bush on several occasions to meet with Coney, meetings that paved the way for peace negotiations. Towards their people, the ARLPI leaders were tireless advocates of forgiveness and reconciliation, of the kind that Angelina practiced. To ease the return of child soldiers and displaced peoples, they advocated the use of rituals found in the tradition of the Acholis, ones that combine forgiveness, truth-telling, reparations, apologies, and a community meal that would mark the end of hostilities and the restoration of the community. Of course, they also appealed to the teachings of their faith. What we see in the ICC on one hand, and in the approach of Angelina and the ARLPI on the other, are two very different answers to the question of what justice means in the wake of massive injustice. The question finds its setting in what amounts to one of the most interesting global trends of the past generation, a proliferation of activities and institutions to address injustices of the past in the interest of peace building. We've seen the criminal court and a host of tribunals for trying war criminals. We've also seen over 40 truth commissions. We've seen reparations schemes. We've seen public apologies as a new trend in global politics. We've seen the discourse and practice of forgiveness. We've seen the building of monuments and memorials. We've seen efforts to build reconciliation at the level of civil society. It is in this setting that the question is asked, what is the meaning of justice in the wake of massive injustice? The dominant answer to this question is what may be called the liberal peace. It is dominant because it prevails in the leading global institutions. By liberal, I mean based on the ideas of the Enlightenment, individual rights, human rights, the rule of law, and the central role for judicial prosecution, The ICC is the central example of what the liberal peace envisions. But an alternative challenger paradigm has also arisen. It shaped the approach in South Africa, Timor-Leste, Guatemala, Chile, Sierra Leone, Uganda, Colombia, and elsewhere. It goes by the name of reconciliation. This is the approach where I've had a lot of experience of my own. I worked for 6 years in Kashmir, traveling there regularly between 2000 and 2006, working for faith-based reconciliation. And then I did work for a few years in the central Great Lakes region of Africa, where I worked with the Catholic Church and helping it to be an agent of reconciliation. One thing that I noticed in my experience is that religious people had a different way of thinking about the question of justice in the wake of massive injustice. Reconciliation is the approach of the Ugandan religious leaders. The central idea is restoration of relationship. It is a holistic restoration. It might include human rights. It does not reject them, but it is much wider, aimed at addressing the wide range of wounds that war and dictatorship inflict on people. It addresses these wounds both because it is intrinsically just and because it helps to build qualities like trust and legitimacy for democratic governments and peace settlements. Unless people's emotions of hatred and revenge are addressed, peace and democracy are not likely to be sustainable. This way of thinking about justice, I argue, comes to us from religious traditions. I have looked at Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In the scriptures of each of these faiths, restoration of right relationship characterizes the action of God, but is also prescribed for horizontal relationships within human communities. Reconciliation is not a utopian end state where everyone is hugging each other. I rather have in mind political reconciliation, where people respect one another's rights as citizens. But even political reconciliation requires far more than rights law and even prosecuting war criminals. In my book, Just and Unjust Peace, I proposed 6 practices that address the range of wounds that political injustices inflict, and each in their own way seek to bring about the restoration of persons and relationships. Briefly, they are, first, the building of socially just institutions. Without this, reconciliation is cheap. In South Africa and the struggle against apartheid, reconciliation was a common theme among opponents of apartheid. At one point, though, in the mid-1980s, a group of Black theologians issued what is known as the Kairos document, where they strongly insisted that any talk of reconciliation had to include the end of the apartheid government and the end of apartheid. It was not adequate or acceptable to speak of reconciliation without that. And so reconciliation involves the building of socially just institutions. Second is acknowledgement. This is the work of truth commissions, where victims are acknowledged by other members of the public and other citizens for their suffering and for their humanity and for the restoration of their status as citizens. This is the work of truth commissions and other forums. Third is reparations. Reparations are a financial transfer to those who have suffered harm from violence and other great injustices. Reparations are a form of acknowledgement, but they are fortified with material aid and assistance to those who have suffered. Fourth is what I call restorative punishment. Some approaches to reconciliation leave out punishment, or they pose reconciliation against punishment, or forgiveness against punishment. But in my view, there is a proper place for forms of accountability for people who have committed serious human rights violations. Now, I think there's a division here to be made between what might be called the big fish, or the people who are at the top of the hierarchy of authority, who are most responsible for being the architects and the people who have given the orders for massive human rights violations to take place. And I think for them, only long-term imprisonment makes sense as a form of punishment. In this sense, I do not oppose the work of the ICC or of courts that deliver just punishment. I think that that has a place, even if they are not the only or the central form of reconciliation. But I think that for people at lower levels of the hierarchy, there can also be forms of accountability that serve to reintegrate people in communities. In places like Rwanda and Timor-Leste, the country utilized community forums that brought together perpetrators with other members of the community and helped to fashion punishments that would reintegrate people into the communities, such as community service or rebuilding homes, for instance. Fifth is apology, which is confession and the taking of responsibility on the part of perpetrators. One of the things that we've seen in the past generation has been the rise of political apologies voiced by heads of state, which have become much more common in global politics. This can be a way of delegitimating and taking responsibility for the injustice and helping to bring restoration. Finally, sixth is forgiveness, the will of victims to forgo resentment and retribution and construct right relationship again. This is a practice that has become more common in many countries around the world, such as South Africa, Uganda, Rwanda, Timor-Leste, and other places. Each of these practices has taken place all over the world in scores of countries around the world over the past generation. It is also worth saying that they are always partially achieved, far from perfect, hobbled by power, complexity, and the sheer magnitude of suffering. But they do take place, and stories and accounts from around the world reveal that they yield successes as well. The most controversial of the practices, and the one that most challenges the liberal peace, is forgiveness. It is the only practice that is not based on rights. No perpetrator has a right to be forgiven, or no perpetrator has a right to be forgiven by a victim. It is rather based on the goodwill of the victim, and as many would say, the grace of God. It has a dramatic, surprising quality, one that interrupts what is expected in terms of deserts and entitlements. There are criticisms of forgiveness. For instance, it is said that forgiveness re-victimizes the victim and forgoes punishment. But I think these criticisms are important, and they highlight important things about reconciliation. But I do believe they can be answered if we see forgiveness as part of the constructive justice of reconciliation. This is what Angelina practiced. And in the past generation, it has been a new element on the scene of global politics. Forgiveness is not something that has a strong pedigree in the politics of the nation state or the thought of the Enlightenment. It is a new dimension of global politics. Does forgiveness actually take place in the political order? After I published my book, Just and Unjust Peace, in 2012, it was reviewed in the New Republic by a critic named Barry Guin. He liked the book, but he was skeptical of forgiveness. He wrote, "Philpott is describing saintly behavior, idealism raised to its highest level. And here is the problem. Saints may be necessary, but they cannot serve as examples for others to follow. They stand out from the rest of humanity by their readiness to sacrifice themselves for their convictions. They dwell beyond normal society, exploding institutions for the greater good as they understand it. To adopt Philpott's good intentions at their warmest, without the skepticism of realist tough-mindedness, can produce fanaticism and self-destruction." Similarly, in the world of scholars, activists, and intellectuals who work in the area of transitional justice, few want to speak of forgiveness, even scholars who adopt reconciliation as their paradigm. There is a kind of existential skepticism. They think that people just don't do this. It would lead to fanaticism and self-destruction, as Guin said. So I conducted a study. I went to Uganda and I interviewed 640 people who had lived through the experience of armed conflict in 5 major regions. We did a survey of 640 people. We conducted 10 focus groups and 27 interviews. The results were that favor for and the practice of forgiveness were remarkably common. One question measured attitudes towards forgiveness by asking respondents whether they agreed to the statement, "It is good for victims to practice forgiveness in the aftermath of violence," to which 86% answered agree, 9% answered disagree, and only 5% answered not sure. Other questions sought to measure the actual practice of forgiveness. One, posed only to victims of violence, asked directly, "Did you personally forgive the perpetrator of the act of violence against you?" Here, 68% of respondents answered yes, and 28% answered no. We were a little bit startled at the results, but one of the things that assured me that they were authentic was that it reflected also what people said in the focus groups and in the interviews. The strongest reason for forgiveness was people's religious faith, their Christianity, and in some cases, Islam. But they also cited forgiveness, that they practiced forgiveness for social peace and psychological benefits as well. Today in Uganda, tens of thousands of people who were abducted into the LRA or lived in camps for displaced people are now reintegrated into their communities. I am widely told that there is still no lasting peace. There are land disputes and continued scores to be settled from the conflict. But most were convinced that the solution is practices of reconciliation that can restore relationships. One hears this unprompted. Today, the ICC has neither tried nor convicted and any of the people it has indicted. Some believe that it even prolonged the war. It is through reconciliation that societies find real hope for peace that will last. I look forward to our discussion and to thinking together about what reconciliation can mean for Spain.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Professor Philpott. Very thought-provoking.